I have the privilege of taking you through an hour, more or less, discussion where we'll hear from several great speakers, all of them discussing the core points and arguments of Mette Olwig's new book under the Cambridge core. And if you go to the next slide, we can see the very nice and green sustainable cover here. A bit too simple narratives of development, sustainability, and climate change, which is hot off the press. My name is Adam Mo Feierskov. I'm a senior researcher at the Danish Institute for International Studies in Copenhagen, where I also head the Department for Sustainable Development and Governance. And once again, we're just very happy that you're here in this webinar done together with EADI. Let me, aside from reading one quote, I think, which captures the book very well that Mette has done, and that is that grounded stories can form the basis for a different form of agency on sustainable development that can be more forceful and productive for local populations, leading to localized understandings of problems and solutions. That's more or less how the book ends. I'm sorry for spoiling it for some of you, if you were just waiting for that one shot. Essentially, also what we'll be talking about today. The role of local stories, local narratives, but also just opposing them vis-a-vis geopolitical larger narratives that altogether shape development, sustainability, and climate action in different forms and with different degrees of agency, localized agency, political agency, and so forth. So, Anna, if you go to the next slide, we can do something quickly on house rules here, so to speak. One is the thing you might have already meant or seen on your screen, namely that this session is being recorded and will also be made available on EADI's website and YouTube channel. So at some point, we will have an opportunity to ask questions to not just Mette, but also to the great speakers who are here. And at that point, I will ask you to unmute yourself and ask your question. And since we have around an hour or so with timing, I might be a little bit strict, but it's just to make sure that everyone gets to say all the different interesting things that they have to say. So as we go to the next slide, let me just introduce you to the different people that we will be listening to. Here in this session, after I've spoken, we will have reactions, presentations, different thoughts from a set of great speakers, reacting essentially to Mette's book, which if you haven't already downloaded it, I can very much advise you to do so. And I assume there will be a link in the chat because it is open access and can thus be downloaded and read for all of you or by all of you. After the presentations, we'll have a Q&A, 20 minutes, like I mentioned, and then we'll have a brief closing before we wrap up this hour here. So essentially, to introduce you to the speakers, obviously, Mette Olwig, who is from Roskilde University and who is the author behind this new book published by Cambridge University Press on a bit too simple narratives of sustainability. Then we have David Singh from the Centre des Sciences Humaines, and we have Lisa and Richey from Copenhagen Business School. We have Conrad John Masabo, who is from Roskilde University and also University of Dodoma. And basically what we will do is that I will ask Mette now to present her book and give her the next few minutes to introduce all of the central arguments and points that she makes in this particular volume. So Mette, the floor is yours for the next minutes. Over to you.
So I'm going to start by giving an overview of the book. And the book is on narratives of development, sustainability, and climate change. And narratives are basically stories. And we tell stories for the purpose of entertainment. But stories also serve a different purpose. Stories, there can be a moral to the story. And the moral to the story often has the intention of changing the behavior of the listener or influencing the behavior of the listener. Stories can also facilitate action in the face of challenges. So if a story is about a particular challenge and the story characters deal with this challenge in a particular way, then this can serve as inspiration for the listener for how to deal with that same kind of challenge. And stories often build on familiar tropes. So a story will often use a storyline that we've heard in various ways before, so sort of using similar buildup of the story, and will also refer to story characters that we have heard of before, such as the hero, the villain, the victim. And the reason I decided to write this book is that I've been doing research on social dimensions of climate change in the past 15 years, and I've been doing research talking to different types of stakeholders, including donors and practitioners and community members. And I've traveled to many different places, including Tanzania and Vietnam and Ghana and Denmark and the US. And what has struck me when doing this research is that I kept hearing the same stories, the same overarching narratives being referred to when stakeholders were explaining to me why they were dealing with the challenge in a certain way, or why this challenge was even happening. So it struck me that it was surprising how similar these narratives were, both in these quite different places, but also these different types of stakeholders repeating these same overarching narratives. What also struck me is that there was quite a big disconnect between these overarching narratives, these stories, and then what I saw on the ground. So what I wanted to do with this book was to look at how, why, and to what effect some narratives have become such a dominant force in driving international action, even when more grounded narratives tell stories that differ. And in the book, I both pay attention to these overarching narratives, but also to the grounded narratives that differ quite a bit from the overarching narratives. And so I want to give an example of one of these overarching narratives, what we could call a meta-narrative, namely the development hero meta-narrative. And the picture you see here, I think, captures this meta-narrative quite well. It's a picture I took in northern Ghana at a climate change event. And as you can see, there are some school children holding signs that say things like pick up litter, climate change, pick up litter. And you can see this, they're also, as part of this event, picking up litter and putting it in these big trash bags. And the event was organized by international volunteers. And so if I were to tell the story behind why this event was organized, the sort of narrative that led to this event, we would start with a disruptive crisis. A story often starts with a disruptive crisis. And in this case, it's climate change. Then we have the familiar characters, the victims, the villains, the heroes. In this story, the victims are the local community members. And as is quite often the case in the development hero meta-narratives, the community members are also the villains in this story. In particular, the community members who litter, who burn the bush, who cut trees. And so to solve the crisis, the behavior of these community members needs to be changed. And this is where the hero comes into the story, the international volunteers who are called to action to change local behavior. So to solve the crisis, the solution is to change local practices. And I'm sure you have probably heard different versions of this development hero story. But the problem with this kind of story is that it deflects attention from important, wider societal and environmental challenges. So climate change is not primarily caused at all by local littering. But this was really the message that was being sent. Instead, climate change is being caused by much wider environmental factors. But the message from the event was that it was linked to local littering, which was also, when I talked to a local community member who was watching the event, I asked, what is this event about? And he said, it's about picking up litter. Our climate is changing, and if we don't pick up the litter, the climate will change. So this was very much the message that was being sent across with this event. So by suggesting that local people can induce climate change through littering, the event subtly conflated climate change with separate local challenges. So climate change action is effectively reduced to blaming local actions. And this provides questionable rationale for external interventions, while also devaluing local understandings of environmental problems and solutions. And what I found, and what I also argue in the book, is that a lot of these meta-narratives that become predominant worldwide are often not the ones that lead to the most effective or equitable actions. Rather, they're the ones that tend to be the ones that uphold the geopolitical status quo by obscuring underlying structural inequalities. And what I also show is that a lot of these meta-narratives build on stories that have been dominant historically. So, for example, the development hero meta-narrative builds very much on this story of the white man's burden that is the title of a poem published by Kipling in 1899. And because of this familiarity, the stories become quite powerful. As I mentioned earlier, stories tend to build on this familiarity, and they do this because by being familiar, they resonate with the listener, and they're also easy to understand. So this makes for quite powerful stories when they keep being repeated like this. And these meta-narratives also become quite effective because they serve the interests of those in power, who therefore perpetuate them through their networks of power. So my book has overall three key arguments. One is that these universalistic development hero meta-narratives fail to capture lived realities, and that this leads to problematic policy and practice. The second is that these long-standing development hero meta-narratives are converging with other influential meta-narratives on climate change and sustainability. And thirdly, I show how these for-profit hero meta-narratives are emerging on sustainable development that reinforce universalistic development logics in problematic ways. So in the book's 6 chapters, I discuss these different narrative elements, such as the storyline of the crisis and the different characters and the solutions. And I use my fieldwork in different parts of the world to illustrate these different narrative elements. And then I talk about these emerging for-profit narratives where the sustainability superhero really is becoming a central character, who can be, for example, a consumer who saves the world through their purchases. So shifting kind of the actors, but really building still on these same ideas. And then I conclude by talking about the importance of mobilizing grounded stories. And as Ada mentioned, it's open access, so I hope you can all easily access it. And that was my short overview of the book. And and I look forward to hearing the next speakers. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mette. This was excellent. Extremely important or interesting also to see how these narratives sometimes infuse politics, sometimes depoliticize in other instances, but are forms of, instruments that have a power to, I think, define and demarcate and so forth. The first reaction we will hear from David. So David, the floor is yours for the next 7 or 8 minutes, please.
Thank you, Adam, and thank you to Mette for the invitation, and congratulations on the publication of your book, A Bit Too Simple. Well, I found the book's central claim being both timely and methodologically very clear and very clarifying. You show us in your book that development, sustainability, and climate change, in those instances, we have powerful meta-narratives that often reduce complex and entangled situations to a simplified linear storyline, this idea of a beginning, a middle, and an end, in ways that make certain actions, interventions, and actors appear both necessary and urgent. So what I want to do in this short presentation is to engage with the book claim through my own research on post-earthquake Western India in Gujarat, drawing on a recent article that I co-authored with Vasudha Chotre on post-disasters landscape in the new India. So I'll try to use very briefly the book's framing of this simplified crisis storyline and the cast of a villain, victim, and hero to make sense of how post-2001 earthquake development interventions in Gujarat in Western India have repeatedly produced, stabilized, and updated a particular meta-narrative of what counts as so-called desirable land, productive livelihoods, and modern futures. So let me start with this idea of a disaster as a story. In your book, Mette, you show us how hero narratives typically begin with this imagined normal condition that is interrupted by the crisis. And then the crisis then becomes a call to action that legitimizes some sort of intervention and often devalues local understandings of both the problem and the solution. And I felt that your claim here resonated very much with how the 2001 earthquake in Gujarat became not only a humanitarian moment, but also a narrative device, a rupture that allowed a new normal to be imposed, to be financed, to be imagined. Indeed, in 2001, within weeks of that earthquake, development banks and the state in Gujarat treated the catastrophe as an opening for bankable reconstruction, for new land management system, and broad deregulation. The World Bank here, the Asian Development Bank, produced a reconstruction cost figure rapidly and advocated deregulation, financialization of aid, private insurance penetration, and also incentives for the private sector to take over activities that were previously undertaken by the state. The Gujarat state, meanwhile, created agencies tasked with the mission of identifying so-called bankable projects and rolled out tax incentive and cheap acquisition rates for government-owned, so-called owned wasteland. And I feel that this is where the book reminds us that the hero's journey always is propelled by the crisis. The hero is called to action, travels to a distant land, and overcome challenges. And I felt that in post-earthquake Kutch, the district that I've studied during my PhD, we see how this distant land is imagined. Indeed, this very peripheral district of Western India has long been imagined by Indian bureaucrats as being peripheral, as being empty, as being underutilized. And how, after the earthquake, this has become a newly visible space for intervention, for accumulation, and for investment. But who becomes the villain, who becomes the victim, and who gets cast as a hero in my own story? Where in Kutch, in Gujarat, the villain is not only the earthquake, the disaster, but the story often shifts towards demonizing particular land uses and livelihoods as waste, idle, and backward. And in the case of a very desert area as Kutch, pastoral practices and the use of common lands have always been treated as unproductive by the state and therefore justifying dispossession because they consider that the local population are not using the land to its full potential value. So in the book's term, this is the move where we see external interventions that are justified by naming local practices as problematic. The victim, as Mette has also mentioned, is someone, also those same people, the local population, who are categorized as the villains and described as population that need to be rescued, that are in need, and that need to be modernized. And I've tried to see how this kind of victim creation is also done through a certain form of regime of waste and value, how the state imposes categories and sorts land and people into categories of desirable, non-desirable, valued, waste, productive, and it. And heroes in my fieldwork also appear at multiple levels. Well, development bank, as Mette has showed in her book, state agencies, entrepreneurial private sector become the engine of recovery. And there's a chapter on that in Mette's book about for-profit development. And also increasingly green industries or green energy infrastructure. So the point here in this field site is not simply that some things or some people are valued or not, but also that the crisis intensifies the authority to some institutions to declare what counts as value and what does not, and to recode entire landscapes and livelihoods as waste, deserted, empty, and unproductive. This is where I feel that the book critiques of this universalistic, streamlined solution meets the complexity of what land looks like and politics around land. The most recent waves of land dispossession that I was able to witness in my fieldwork were for wind energy infrastructures. And I also felt that the narrative around those developments were very familiar to what Mette develops in her book. Renewable energy has a new green modernity. Decarbonization has, an unsustainable good, and idle land being promised to more productive uses. But in practice and on the ground, as described by Mette, we see how pasture commons are destroyed, how land is dispossessed, and how local access gets abruptly restricted by these turbines, these roads, these trucks, and how state corporate alliances relies on brokers, development brokers, also discussed by Mette, the use of money, the use of muscle power to shut down resistance, and also administrative acts like the development of new revenue map that shift contested pastoral land into the category of government-owned wasteland. So this is exactly the kind of processes that Mette's book, A Bit Too Simple, alerts us to, that simplified crisis storylines can make intervention feel self-evident and urgent. so urgent that, to quote Mette, normal processes of critical scrutiny and accountability are simply skipped. So the crisis here in my field work was not only the earthquake, it was not only the disaster, but it was all those interventions that happened afterwards. It is this continually refreshed by development and urgency, by investment timetables, and now by climate. So my takeaway from Mette's book and my fieldwork in Catch is that what matters is not only whether we pursue recovery and development and climate actions, but how these actions are narrated into necessity and urgency, and how they are then translated into very powerful legal and material arrangements that redistribute power, land, and voice. I'll stop here, and thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to engage with your book, Mette.
Thank you so much, David. This was excellent. I mean, in terms of reductionism, interventionism, and the self-evident or naturalization of that intervening power, I think was absolutely great. Next, we turn to Lisa. Richey, please, Lisa, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I hope that you can all hear me okay. It is a pleasure to engage with this book, partially because it's a book that I have seen coming in its development for a long time, but it is also because it's a book which, to be a bit too simple, manages in a very, very small, very, very accessible way to present extremely important and complicated arguments. And I really have, kudos for Mette, because it's not easy to actually present things as being oversimplified in a way which is clear. And this is very incredibly good, clear communication. And I think it's very useful for us because I was reading it at the same time, actually, I was reading one of my favorite novelists, Jeanette Winterson's new book called One Aladdin, Two Lamps. And Winterson actually deals with some pretty similar themes, in fact, as this book, particularly around the power of storytelling. A well-told story is powerful. A well-told overarching story, or a meta-narrative, is even more powerful, writes Mette's narrative on page 7 here in this book. So Mette asked me to tell one of my many stories of helping from work on for-profit partnerships in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And at first, I considered one from another book, which is linked to the Commodifying Compassion Project, which Mette was also a partner and collaborator on. This book, Batman Saves the Congo. It's fun not to have slides. I can pull things up from my desk. But then I said, actually, I'd like to go back further. And Mette has already given us a good reason why, because the issues that she introduces, particularly, for example, the white man's burden, that was published in McClure's magazine at exactly the same time that we saw an advertisement for Pear's soap, where they claimed that the white man's burden was actually what you could use Pear's soap to wash out of any dark places. So this link between these ideas and their power and the fact that you could actually profit from that, the fact that somebody's going to sell them and they're going to gain, is as old as the narratives which we discuss in this book and in this conference. So to go back to earlier examples that set the stage for what I think we're seeing today, which is very much part of our discussions in the humanitarian development and transnational aid community about the evisceration of the public aid sector, exemplified, for example, by the nomination of, by Sweden of IKEA's CEO to lead the world's largest organization for refugees, UNHCR, and many other examples, including the ones that Mette has in her book. I found an example which includes still my favorite superhero, Batman. And this is from an article that I had published back over a decade ago. So it was 2014 in this journal, which is called Forum for Development Studies, also open access online. And it's interesting to me, and I'd like to share parts of the story with you, because there's so much of this that resonates with exactly the very clear way that Mette has unpacked how narratives work in sustainability today and how they started working more than a decade ago. So I'm going to read you a little story, and then I have a few questions for Mette at the end. So the story is about what I call the troubling practice called we can be heroes. It's troubling practice because it's an example of selling stories of international development through this brand aid initiative called We Can Be Heroes, where DC Comics, a Warner Brothers entertainment company, launched a fundraiser based on the sale of several images that carried the Justice League characters, for any of you all who are comic fans. And it included things like a We Can Be Heroes iPhone, a case that read, "One small act can make you a hero." You've read many of exactly these kinds of claims in Mette's books because they have such resonance. Other products that they sold were things like t-shirts, mugs, posters, a water bottle. And DC Entertainment promised to give half, 50% of the purchase price to their nonprofit partners, who were, not surprising to us today, Save the Children, the International Rescue Committee, and Mercy Corps. And this was to fight hunger in a vague description of Africa. And I promise not to scare quote that every time, but I want you to remember, drawing on scholars like Mujimbe, that when we say Africa, we're talking about a place which is obviously overconstituted with a lot of scripts about what we imagine it means, rarely linked to what we're actually talking about. So they did these donations. They had all sorts of celebrities, which is some work that Mette has also worked on in the past. Singer Chris Daughtry provided a song for the soundtrack called Rescue Me, literally. And the initiative website, which gave us really the only information we had, said, "Worst hunger crisis in 60 years. We've done worse since. Over 9 million in need of immediate assistance. The people in the Horn of Africa need you." And then we see a photograph of some small, forlorn-looking, supposedly African girl sitting above a link to donate, and another which is showing a darkness and light art inspired by the Heroes and Villains, Hope and Heroism campaigns. The centerpiece, however, of this webpage is a powerful 2-minute video clip that begins, not too surprisingly, with an image of a white girl. She's around 13 years old, and she appears to be somewhere in the north because she's wearing a very heavy winter jacket and she's on a very busy traffic street. This is juxtaposed over a silhouette of Batman. And the words come onto the screen saying, "In the Horn of Africa, 13 million people are suffering through the worst hunger crisis in 60 years. They need a hero." The silhouette then shifts to Wonder Woman and Superman, and Africa fades into the background glow. And the words come up, "What do you do when someone needs you?" Then we see the video shifting to a diverse group of North American urbanites. The first to speak is an African-American man who responds to this challenge, saying, "Oh, a time in my life when, oh, that's really hard, when I felt needed." And then they go on to a different cast of characters, all of which talked about how they feel needed by this cause-related marketing campaign to try to convince people to buy particular branded products to save unknown Africans. It's a 2-minute, 9-second entire imaginary of multicultural heroism in which men, women, and children of all races come together to save millions of anonymous suffering Africans. Now, the thing that is so difficult about this is, I'm telling you, this was a campaign from 2012. The fact that we still see these provocative examples where anyone with a credit card can try to become an international development actor, working in these alliances, and we see the privatization of help, replacing public donors with private philanthropy, linked to what we have studied together, Mette and I, and the commodification of compassion, is something that goes from this old green book to this brand new green book. And the same sticky narratives are things which we have to question. And Mette does an amazing job in this book at telling us not just why, but what other narratives are possible. So a few questions. As a geographer, I'd like to hear a little bit more about the locations of narratives from this book. Does place matter? I think we think it does. And if we agree that it does, then one way to combat the dehumanization of the single story is through the proliferation of these grounded stories, like the ones that Mette tells. But then is the next step to actually change the process of listening, the structured valuation of any individual stories. So Mette, I want to hear a little bit more from you about what you mean on page 1 when you talk about a geopolitical storyline. That's the political scientist in me. Is that the same as the colonial storyline? Is that the same as the storyline that we've been hearing for decades, selling us development? And tell us a little more about who, why, and where we have local. So again, I went back to some really old texts, like the OG book here by Ginsberg and Rapp, who wrote back in 1995, this is my age showing, that we're really still trying to discern what's the difference between local and global. So is local just a context which is identified by some geography and not superimposed on things which are rural or less cosmopolitan? Or does local refer to the level of analysis and international decision-making? If it's not being used to refer to a geographical location or a state of some traditional existence, then how do we distinguish it between narratives that are local and those that are global, between those that are political and those that are geopolitical? So our previous research that we've done in collaboration suggests that we consider the notion of discursive distance as a tool for thinking about some of these questions of local and the location of narratives, and that we could try to think about whether a discourse or a narrative or a meta-narrative is rooted, in fact, in a conceptualization that's not local, if it comes with standardized parts and uniform methods of assembly, for example. Is it constructed in form and content to correspond with local realities, or its promoters in positions where they would gain or lose according to how well their discourse corresponds with an external ideal or an external meta-narrative? So why do we care today that some unfortunate elder is shouting about 2 dog sleds or a parcel of land and claims that this should be his? This is not because of the power of his narrative, but because of the power of the technological and military arsenal under his command to make that meta-narrative a different kind of narrative. Thank you so much, Mette, for giving us a really fantastic, clear introduction in this book to meta-narratives and to narratives and how they work. And I look forward to hearing more from you about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. That was excellent. I got the pun on meta-narratives and meta-narratives. Before we turn to maybe back to Mette as well, but open up the Q&A where there's a possibility to ask a question or two, I will give the word to Masabo, please. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. And I thank Mette for the gift of this book that helps us to reflect on different issues and that are quite key in not only my own research, but on the discussion that is going on, particularly in my country, Tanzania, with regard to climate change. And it helps me to understand the puzzle that has kept me asking myself the question, we don't do that much in terms of climate destruction, but why are we suffering too much out of it? And as somebody who is researching in school, especially climate change, then this book serves as a stepping stone to reflect on how schools now are becoming the agent of meta-narratives. And this was quite striking for me. And as I was reading, then I was intrigued, like, does it begin with the pressure for climate change? Then I went back to the history and I found that probably why this meta-narrative of solution to climate change that take tree planting as a solution that gets much acceptance in Tanzania have much longer history back to the time of the German colonial history period, where the German introduced the so-called state forestry. But at the same time, while they were advocating for planting trees, they were also ready to allow cutting down of local trees in favor of plantation. So the same as the story that Mette develops, that countries can advocate for particular simple solution to hide their own interest in the economies of scale and the power they have. So it kept me again asking myself, why is it that Tanzania is fascinated with forest conservation? Then I got the history from the British. Particularly, I was interested that to better understand why schools today serve as the agents of these meta-narratives. The stories of Tanzania, especially after 1967, the declaration of Ujamaa as a national policy and education for self-reliance as an education policy, is one of the bedrocks where this policy or this simplification resonates. So during the 60s, when Ujamaa became the policy and the education for self-reliance became the education policy, schools were expected to have sort of self-reliant projects. Most of the schools ended up having farms. And within farms, the school nurseries were one of the prominent elements that the school were advocating. And from then, if schools were having these tree nurseries, then, or if the schools were planting trees, that became the symbol of a patriotism or a school that is resonating with the policy of socialism or Ujamaa, as we called it in Tanzania. So these schools and the village forests became part and parcel of the Tanzania social political understanding of the Ujamaa policy. So tree planting as a solution, when it came with the neoliberal policies, which now came to address things like global warming, like climate change, the so-called nature-based solution. Then trees, this planting of trees built on this background history, and that's why if you come to Tanzania, and as Mette narrates in the book, you find that there are more stories that seems to support that Tanzania is ready to plant trees to deal with the climate change. But again, if you go back to the history, you'll find that behind the current programs in tree planting, like the Red Plus, which is the UN project for reduction of emission through afforestation, you will find that behind it, there are powerful organizations, powerful countries that campaigns those to hide their own action. And here I can cite an example of a neighboring country, Norway, which is typically a country that runs much of its economy on fossil fuel. So to hide that, Norway is active supporting projects of tree planting in Tanzania under the NORAD. So you will find that that's how these meta-narratives flips in, and we think that the solution, but in Tanzania, they work better because they have a longer history and a foundation that gives it a better a place to plan. So my interest particular, which intrigued me, was how nowadays schools are becoming the agents of these meta-narratives. So the schools, through two programs, both environmental clubs plus the school curriculums, you will find that they are bringing in these meta-narratives to become central to the orientation that they give the students. And at the end, the schools end up doing what some scholars have called producing students as subjects of climate change. So students, when they graduate, they have already grabbed all this terminology, all this understanding, then they become agents to advocate for it. And the bad story of it, they also brings in the blame aspect as a part of that dose of the school, of the students in the schools. So students become their own, the agents of their own alienation, because they advocate that the local practices are bad for climate, are bad for environment. And at the same time, they perpetuate these ideas that have not taken into consideration the local dynamics. But again, as somebody doing research in schools, I find some hope, like as Mette puts it, that there are some elements of agent among the actors. And in schools, particularly if you go the place in Moshi, where there are more clubs for planting trees, there is an increasing elements of questioning about this meta-narrative of planting trees as the solution to climate change. And what these students are doing in these clubs, they are now questioning why should we plant trees of the seeds that are imported seeds. Instead, they are advocating to plant local trees. So there is a sort of like a realization that this campaign in the long run have some consequences. So probably the only way we can try to deal with it in our own weak position is better we advocate for the local seedling of trees. Probably these trees might help to address the problem. But it remains a point that schools are actively at the center, probably unknowing, or some other schools are knowing that they are at the center to perpetuate these meta-narratives. So you will find all the schools, especially where I have been doing research, students are mentioning about planting trees as the solution to climate change. And that tells how this meta-narrative have flipped into the school curriculum. So nowadays, the way they communicate this message of climate change seems to be climate change equal to carbon emission, and the carbon capture equal to climate solution. So something which is very simplified to a very complicated problem, which would require countries, especially those who are emitting, who are doing destruction that affects the climate, instead of their action for things like degrowth or reconsidering their economies, they then hide in this campaign, support school, support countries, and now, like the vice president's office in Tanzania, have taken tree planting as the nature-based solution strategy for climate change. So you can see that from school, now those who graduate from school, when they become part of the leadership, then they take with them this kind of simplified story, and now that becomes the policy and become the action, they become the strategy, which in a long run probably will not take us anywhere as a country and anywhere as a globe. So I think particularly Mette for bringing this kind of thinking about these meta-narratives and how they work. But I would also say that some meta-narratives, especially those in Tanzania for planting trees, are working better in Tanzania because Tanzania have already a fertile land for such kind of thinking. So for now, I stop here and hopefully I'll get time to engage with Mette with regard for this book. But I think it's a nice book, and I would rather recommend to all those people who are teaching climate change in schools. It helps to take these simple stories, but which communicate powerful messages. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Masabo. Excellent points across the board from our three speakers and commenters on this book. We have around 15 minutes left, so if anyone has a question or two, let me open up. I think we have room for at least 1 to 2 questions before I turn it over to Mette to respond to the different questions that have also been posed by our other speakers. So if you have a question, please raise your hand, and then I can call out your name and you can pose the question. And we wait 10 seconds, and if nothing happens, I will send it to you, Mette, because I think there are already many questions. Lisa asked about place and space, the local global question. How does space shape narratives? I thought that was an excellent question. I'm just trying to keep a lookout here. But also what we just heard from Masabo in terms of genealogical nature of these green narratives, and David talking about sort of green modernity as a form of justification or a naturalization of interventionism, which I thought was an excellent perspective as well. So, Mette, do you want to respond to some of the things you've heard thus far? And I think everyone has a chance to reconsider if they have any questions that they can then raise their hand. Mette, please.
Yeah, thank you so much, and thank you for these presentations. It was really interesting to hear how different how the book spoke to different aspects of the work that you're doing, and yeah, super interesting. I'd love to hear a lot more. Yeah, so if there's no questions from the audience, I mean, I guess I can start by saying a bit about how one of what differs from a meta-narrative to sort of the stories that communities tell that shape community belonging and sense of belonging to the community and community cohesion. What's different with these meta narratives is that they aren't really connected to a place. They're able to travel around the world. They're sort of universalistic in their style and become it becomes possible for them to travel around the world in a way that makes them more powerful. And part of the reason they can do that is because of the development sector's presence all over the world also. So that it's really through this infrastructure that's provided through the development sector that these narratives can become ingrained in local places in ways where they are not questioned locally, even when they don't really, even when there's this big disconnect between what's going on in the place and what the narrative describes. So one of the first times I became aware of these narratives was when I was doing interviews in northern Ghana, where the picture was from that I showed. And I was talking about, I was doing interviews because there had been flooding in the area. And this northern Ghana is quite dry normally. So a lot of the interventions in that area are focused on drought. But there had been flooding in part because it had rained in an unusual way, which was being linked to climate change, and also because of a dam and breaking or being opened to avoid it overflowing in the local area. And so when I was interviewing people, we were talking about, they were showing me the destruction from the flood, but then they would say, but it's because we didn't plant enough trees, so it didn't rain enough. And that's why we're getting desertification. And it was just very strange because we were talking about drought, and then somehow it got changed to being about, I mean, we're talking about flooding, but somehow it got changed to being about drought, which was a reflection of this narrative about this area that was the desertification narrative, where there's this idea that because local, or there is this very strong story that because local people don't plant trees, it causes desert, which has been shown to be quite problematic from a scientific perspective. But it's so dominating in this area that even when we were talking about floods, when I was being told solutions, it was to plant trees to get more rain. So somehow these narratives become so powerful that they don't need to be relevant for the place, even, but can still become really powerful in a place. And this is because narratives aren't necessarily the narratives that narratives aren't always based on scientific sort of facts. They're much more based on emotions and on the entertainment value and these other different aspects that influence whether a narrative becomes convincing, not so much whether it's true. So that's something that makes narratives, these meta narratives, quite different in terms of being anchored in a place, is that they can become relevant to a place and important in a place, even if they don't actually describe the place or are related to the place in a particularly meaningful way. So I think that's what I would respond to that. Yeah, I don't know if we should again see if there's anybody who has any questions, or it would also be nice maybe to give the rest of the speakers, because it's a roundtable, so it's not just me responding, but if the other speakers would like to add something now that they've also heard each other's.
Yeah, I think that would be great. If I can just add one thing, which could also be a question, then if someone would like to respond to, they're more than welcome to it. I think there's something around this discussion on, I mean, Mette, you talk about emotions versus scientific facts, and it's not so much about the facility of what is being said. It's much more about the resonance in terms of emotions. But on the other hand, you also talk about this geopolitical nature of meta narratives, and Lisa talked about the material power perhaps behind some of these narratives. So I'm also just curious, you can respond if you want. Any of you don't have to. You're also more than welcome to say different response to what Mette has said. But I think there's something around sort of material power versus ideational power, if we can call it that, and how that works vis-a-vis these narratives. That is super interesting and will be interesting for us to talk about. So anyone who would like among the speakers to react to some of the things that Mette has said? Please, David.
I think there is the way this material power works with the ideation. The ideation overpowers the material in the sense that the material seems to hide behind the ideation, which is then projected as the reality of or the problem or the solution instead of the actual solution. And here I take an example of tree planting that I was trying to say. Tree planting is projected as an ideal solution to climate change. But behind it, those people or those countries which are advocating for carbon trading, they want to continue with their lives on the expenses of this that trees can solve the problem. While the solution, the science have shown that trees cannot solve the climate solution. What we need is to change our model of lives. But since we have created this ideational element of good practice, good act of carbon capture and carbon trading, those who can plant trees are projected as the shield hiding those who cannot, who have resisted to change their mode of life. So they continue with their economies, they continue with their practices, everything continues as it is. And then we use this simplified projection ideation solution of a good practice of buying carbon plus good practice of supporting tree planting. And those becomes the solution we see, but the actual thing, we don't touch the problem. So I find that if we take the material versus the ideation is projected in front of the material in order, because if the material was to be at the front, it meant that countries were to spend more to address the climate. Instead, now they are spending less and they are doing much of the ideation solution in order to continue with their daily practices.
Thank you so much. David, did you want to say something as well?
I just had a question if we have time. I had a question to Mette.
We have a few minutes that would allow Mette maybe to end off before we finalize.
All right, I'll make it very short then. I was just wondering, Mette, how you understand the competition between different meta-narratives, because it seems that the meta-narratives that you describe have evolved and have shifted over time, and some of them might be in competition with each other. Not all of them are successful and are becoming hegemonical. So, for example, in India, the development intervention narrative post-independence was mostly that the state was supposed to steer this development and was going to bring development to rural area. And post the liberalization in the 90s, it was given to the private sector, and the private sector was supposed to steer growth. I wonder, how do you navigate different forms of meta-narrative, since you are looking at different also geographical context? If you want to say a bit more about this competition and shifts in meta-narrative over time.
Thanks, David. Lisa, do you have a very quick question, and then Mette can have a few minutes to round off before I get the final say?
Thanks. Yeah, I would like to just follow up a little bit on the discussion that the other discussants have brought up, because I thought that Masabo's comment, which was really interesting and really caught my mind in relation to the book, was when he said that students become their own agents of alienation. And I wonder, Mette, if you want to talk a little bit about your conclusions in the book, because I thought it was fantastic that, you come in and, you bring in what everybody sort of knows of, EADI is the dangers of a single story. But the dangers aren't just that it's a single story, right? The dangers are that it is a disempowering, dehumanizing story. And you talk here on page 62 about breaking the dignity of the people, that stories have the power to break the dignity of people, or, that you say, being continually presented as victims. This is from Mette's book here on page 62, who need to be saved from their own villainous behavior toward the environment, or anything else for that matter, can, for example, induce local people to question the validity of their own understandings, particularly of environmental challenges and how to address these challenges. And I think that that's getting a little bit to what you pointed out, Adam, this link between ideational change and material change, And the fact that as soon as you really have colonized the mind, as Ngugi would say, then material change is something which is really almost impossible to make happen. So I think linking the two, you do a really good job, in the conclusion saying, but we can tell different stories, right? That if, stories have the ability to dehumanize, then they also have the ability to humanize. And so I wondered if you wanted to speak a little bit more about that, or perhaps to close on one of those examples, maybe given our current state of global affairs. I'm just looking for some optimism to end our session, but I'll reach out for that. Thank you again for a great book and a great discussion.
Thanks, Lisa. Mette, you have a few minutes, and then I just briefly round off.
Oh yes, it's just hard to figure out what to say in a few minutes. I think in this book I focused on the development hero meta narratives, but of course there are different meta narratives, and different organizations will also revert to different types of meta narratives. So there's also there's increasing focus on also the indigenous knowledge and indigenous populations as being the hero. So that's a different type of meta narrative that serves a different purpose and has a different sort of. So of course there's not just one, but I just focused on that in this book, and they can be drawn on in different contexts and have and coexist. And also to say that not everything is a narrative. There has to be sort of like a coherent connection between the different things that are being connected in to make it a story, really. And Lisa, you call for a more optimistic conclusion. So I'm trying to remember here what I say that could be positive. But I think what I really called for in the book is that we can't just expect to fall over these more grounded stories and grounded narratives. We need to actually seek them out. And that's why I'm saying mobilizing grounded stories. And I do see that this is happening more today, that people are actively challenging. I mean, there's also a lot of people who are not, but there is a tendency for more mainstream media to include other types of stories, and also for individuals to seek out other stories and not just the sort of what's familiar. And I think that's really what needs to happen, is that we can't just, when we do research, when we do interventions as development practitioners, whatever field it is, you have to actively seek out these alternative, more grounded stories. You can't just expect them to sort of come to you. And I think that's also something that we can do in our everyday life in terms of what we read and what movies we watch and so on. So I guess that could be one way to sort of, and I also see this happening increasingly, that people are interested in stories from other places. So that, I guess, could be one way to try to conclude it more positively.
Thank you so much, Mette. And I think maybe I can make a link here as well to EADI's ongoing work on decolonization stories, which are also an attempt to capture grounded stories for how to engage, or essentially, I mean, I've written here whether it's a little bit also about the provincialization of meta-narratives, if I can use that intertextual reference. Please go and read the book, A Bit Too Simple, Narratives of Development, Sustainability and Climate Change. It's available, open access by Cambridge. I think a slide will come up where there's also a little bit of a QR code to a survey you can do after this webinar. Thank you so much to all of you for sticking around. Thank you to our excellent speakers. Thank you and congratulations, obviously, to Mette for the new book, but also to David, to Lisa, and to Masabo for their excellent comments, and for EADI for co-hosting. Thank you so much, and see you next time, I feel like saying.